Traoré's daily schedule had private study marked every Wednesday from 15 Norin to 18 Nor. Presidential assistants never scheduled appointments during these hours. Security protocol restricted all access to the Palace's West Wing during these 3 hours. What the public didn't know was that during this time was examining the world's most dangerous information in a secret room, equipped with modern technology, located in what was once the cellar of the former colonial governor's palace. The first time Colonel Amara Canute had been shown the room, he had expected something grandiose, perhaps a space befitting the conspiratorial whispers that circulated among palace staff about the mysterious door at the end of the West Wing service corridor. The reality was both more mundane and more extraordinary. The door itself was unremarkable. Solid oak painted a deep burgundy that had faded to a rusty redover. Decades with a simple brass handle and an advanced electronic lock discreetly retrofitted into the ancient frame. It looked like 100 other doors in the sprawling colonial-era palace that now served as Burkina Faso's Sitof government. What lay beyond, however, was anything but ordinary. You understand, President Ibrahim Traoré had told him that first day that what I'm about to show you exists in absolute secrecy. Only 3 people currently know of this room: myself, Minister Ur, and Dr. Sankara. You will be the 4th. Konet, who had served as Traoré's head of security since the young military leader had assumed power, had nodded solemnly. As a courier military intelligence officer, he understood the value of secrecy, especially in a country where foreign powers had long maneuvered to maintain control through information advantage. The President Hood placed his palm against a section of wall beside the door that appeared identical to the surrounding plaster. A soft blue light had briefly illuminated his hand, followed by a nearly inaudible click as the electronic lock disengaged. Theometric security, Traoré had explained, retrofitted by our own engineers, not foreign contractors. The technology is simple, but effective and impossible to access remotely. The door had opened to reveal a narrow staircase descending below the palace foundations. The steps were old stone, worn smooth by centuries of use, but the lighting was modern. Recessed LED fixtures that activated automatically as they descended. At Thebatom, another security system, this one requiring both retinal scanning and a numeric code guarded, the entrance tohat had clearly once been the colonial governor's private wine cellar. The space beyond, however, bore no resemblance to its original purpose. The room Conite entered was approximately 60 square meters, its stone walls now lined with acoustic dampening materials and thermal insulation. The central feature was a circular table surrounded by casas, above which hung a sophisticated holographic projection system. Along one wall stood a row of advanced computer workstations, while another held physical filing systems, old-fashioned but secure against electron clickers or hacking. Most striking was the far wall, which displayed a massive digital map of Africa, overlaid with pulsing indicators, data points, and connection lines that shifted and updated in real time. Welcome, Traoré had said, to what we call simply the archive. Now, 6 months later, Colonel Kayadisen did those same stairs for his weekly briefing. The memory of that first visit still vivid. Each Wednesday, he joined the president and the other 2 authorized personnel. Foreign Minister Ouedraogo and Aminata Sankara, the brilliant young historian who had first discovered the documents that led to the creation of this facility. The transformation of this ancient wine cellar into a high-tech intelligence center had been accomplished with remarkable secrecy. Rather than bringing in foreign contractors who might have ties to Western intelligence services, Traoré had assembled a small team of trusted Burkinabe engineers. They had worked during a carefully orchestrated true renovation of the palace, a project that provided cover for the extensive modifications end. Most ingenious was the power and data infrastructure completely independent from the palace's main systems. The archive had its own power generation, air handling, and communications capabilities, making it functionally a self-contained facility within the larger structure. This independence ensured that no unusual patterns in power consumption or data traffic would betray its existence. As Cannonade entered, he found other 3 ready present. Traoré stood studying the digital map while Dr. Sankara worked at one of the computer stations. Minister Arago sat at the central table reviewing physical documents. Colonel-era acknowledged him with a nod. "You're just in time. Dr. Sankara has made a breakthrough in the Marseilles archives." Dr. Sankara, no relation to Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader, assassinated in 1987, though she had been named in his honor, turned it from her workstation at 32. She was younger than most high-level government advisors, but her expertise in colonial-era documentation and digital archaeology had made her invaluable to Traore's project. "I've managed to decrypt another section. Oft directive files," she said, activating the holographic display above the central table. "These documents date from 197-81982. The transitional period when physical resource control was being converted to financial control mechanisms. The holographic display showed scanned images of documents bearing the letterheads of various Western financial institutions, government departments, and corporations. Sections of text wary lighted connections between documents, illustrated with glowing lines. The resource Continuity Minister Ouedraogo explained for Canada's benefit. Was the classified Western strategy to maintain control of African resources after formal decolonization. Phase 1 was direct colonial control. Phase 2, waste installation of compliant governments. Phase 3, which these documents detail, was the creation of financial structures that would ensure continued resource extraction regardless of who governed. Konati studied through documents with growing understanding, though he had been briefed on the archive's purpose months ago. Each weekly session revealed new layers to what President Traore had called the longest-running conspiracy in modern history. The archive itself had begun with a discovery made by Dr. Sankara 3 years earlier. While searching colonial land ownership records in France's National Archives, she had stumbled upon a misfiled document, a partial index referencing something called the Resource Continuity Directive. Her attempts to access Terra Francum Italia's had been blocked, officially categorized as state security matters. Despite buying colonial-era documents that should have been declassified decades ago. Rather than accepting this obstruction, she had brought her discovery to Ibrahim Traoré, then a rising military officer known for his nationalist views. He had immediately telegraphed the significance of what she had found. Potential documentary evidence of the systematic mechanisms designed to maintain Western control of African resources after formal independence. What had begun as a historical research project had transformed into something far more significant after Traore came to power. Using diplomatic channels, intelligence operations, hacking, and a network of sympathetic archivists across Europe and America, they had gradually limbled what amounted to the secret blueprint of neo-colonial control. The breakthrough issue, Dr. Sankara said, enlarging a specific document. This 1981 memo from the French Ministry of Finance to the Bank for International Settlements outlines the creation of what they called sovereign debt management protocols. For former colony, she highlighted specific passages ensuring that mineral export revenues remain committed to debt service regardless of governmental changes and currency mechanisms that preclude independent monetary policy while maintaining the appearance of sovereignty. This validates what we've long suspected, Traore said, voice measured, despite the explosive nature of the information. The CFA France system and the associated debt structures weren't just economic policy. They were deliberately designed as control mechanisms to replicate rectonation. Minister Ouedraogo nodded grimly, and it explains why every African leader who has attempted to exit these systems has faced either coup attempts, assassination, or economic warfare, including Thomas Sankara. Dr. Sankara added quietly. The name hung in the air. Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader had been assassinated in 1987 after implementing policies that challenged French economic control, including questioning the debt structure imposed on African nations and attempting to create independent pathways. What's most significant about this new material, Dr. Sankara continued, is that it explicitly mentions mineral resources that weren't commercially exploited at the time, including rare earth elements that have become crucial for modern technology. She pulled up another document, this one from a mining consortium. They knew about these deposits in the 1970s, decades before they were officially discovered. The strategy was to deliberately delay exploitation, until the debt control systems were firmly established. Colonel Kennedy absorbed this information, connecting it to military intelligence he had gathered over his career. This explains patterns we've observed but could never fully document why certain exploration licenses were delayed, why specific leaders were targeted for removal. Exactly, Traore said. This isn't just historical research. It's actionable intelligence that explains the present and allows us to predict how they'll respond to Traore's resources, Virgati initiatives. He turned to the large digital map, which now displayed pulsing indicators across multiple African nations. These represent the current pressure points. Nations where resource control is buying contest, leaders facing destabilization, financial mechanisms being deployed against sovereignty. The map was a sobering visualization of ongoing neo-colonial control, not through direct military occupation, but through financial systems, strategic corruption, and targeted intervention. We've Mopadu Proctum, 60% of the directive's implementation structure. Dr. Sankara reported enough to understand the system and identify vulnerabilities and to share with trusted partners. Minister Orego added indicating a section of the map where several West African nations were highlighted in green. Leaders who have been brought into the archivant, African leaders who had demonstrated genuine commitment to source sovereignty. Not through public disclosure, which would merely prompt denials and disinformation, but through discredited brines that provided these leaders with informational leverage needed to counter external control attempts. Mali and Niger have already used archive intelligence to renegotiate mining contracts. Traore noted, Guinea is implementing the financial countermeasures we developed based on the banking documents. Colonel Kennedy studied the map with professional appreciation. What they had created here, hidden behind the Inuzamin Redor, was essentially an intelligence operations center focused on a single mission, documenting and countering the systems of resource extraction that had kept Africa impoverished despite its natural wealth. Today's priority, Traore continued, is preparing the briefing package for President Godi of Mali. French financial institutions are preparing to implement Directive Protocol 37B against his government following the announcement of the new gold export regulations. The debt market manipulation strategy. Minister Uragok clarified, we've documented how it was deployed against Ghana in 2011 and Zambia in precisely, but this time they'll be implementing it against a government that knows it's coming and has prepared countermeasures. Traore allowed himself a small smile. The effectiveness of these control systems depends on their invisibility. Undocumented and anticipated, they can be neutralized. For the next 2 hours, the small team worked methodically analyzing documents, updating the surveillance map, preparing briefing materials, and discussing countersym for anticipated control attempts. The work was meticulous and often technical, involving financial regulations, resource contracts, and diplomatic leverage. Points. As they worked, Colonel Canet reflected on the extraordinary nature of what they were doing. The archive represented something unprecedented in post-colonial Africa, a systematic effort to document and counter the very mechanisms designed to perpetuate external control while maintaining the illusion of independence. Most revolutionary of all was the approach, not public denunciations or ideological declarations, but quiet, methodical intelligence work that gave African leaders the informational advantage they had long been denied. Traore circled the holographic display, studying a particularly complex network of financial institutions and corporate entities that functioned as intermediaries in mineral export arrangements. The pattern is consistent across multiple countries, he observed. Financialisms, structured tonsure, revenue diversion. Regardless of the contract terms, the same model implemented in different resource sectors, different countries, by different colonial powers. It suggests coordination at a level by individual governments or corporations. The Bank for International Settlements, Minister Uriogo suggested, these documents repeatedly reference Basel protocols for resource-backed financial instruments, which would explain why attempts to renegotiate with individual Western governments or corporations have historical liefeld. Traore added, the control systems transcend national borders. They're embedded in the international financial architecture. This realization had profound implications for resource sovereignty efforts. African nations couldn't simply renegotiate with former colonial powers. They needed to address the structural elements of the global financial system that, had been deliberately designed to maintain resource extraction pathways. "There's something else," Dr. Sankara said, as their session neared its conclusion. "I've identified what appears to be a secondary arc of private banking documents related to what they called Special Resource Acquisition Funds from N-Shedsplayed, an index document showing hundreds of transaction records. These would document financial incentives provided to specific African officials who facilitated continued resource access after indentence, the compliance payments," Minister Arago said. "We've seen references to them in other documents, but never the action." "Can you access them?" Traore asked. Dr. Sankara hesitated. "Possibly, but not remotely. An operation would extend their activities beyond digital research and into something approaching espionage. I have contacts in Geneva," Colonel Kennedy studied carefully, "people who might be able to help with such access discreetly." Traore considered this. "Prepare a feasibility study, Colonel. No action without my explicit approval. These records would be valuable, but not at the cost of exposing the archive's existence." He circled back to the central table, surveying their work. "What we've accomplished here goes beyond documenting historical wrongs. We're creating an operational blueprint for resource liberation, a counterbalance to the directive itself." The comparison was apt, just as their source, Continuity Directive, had provided Western governments and corporations with a systematic approach to maintaining colonial after formal decolonization. The archive was developing systematic approaches to countering those very mechanisms. "Speaking of operational matters," Colonel Cadet said, "we need to address security concerns." It was a valid point, disputaire precautions. The regular Wednesday afternoon security restrictions around the West Wing might, eventually, randomize the schedule, Minister Arago suggested. "No," Traore decided, after a moment's consideration. "The regularity provides cover, just another standing meeting in a governmental of routines. But we should establish secondary access routes and varied entrance patterns." Colonel worked with Dr. Sankara on implementing those changes as the meeting concluded and they prepareto leave the secure room. What had begun as a historical research project evolved into something that was actively reshaping Africa's relationship with former colonial powers. Not through public confrontation, but through the quiet power of information asymmetry. Sometimes, he remarked to his small team, the most effective revolution is the one your opponent doesn't realize is happening until it's already succeeded. First Minister Arago, then Dr. Sankara, followed by Colonel Canute, with President Traore last. The security systems reset behind them, once again concealing one of the most closely guarded secrets in Africa, behind an unassuming red door in an old colonial palace. What none of them realized as they returned to their public duties was that the archive secrecy had already been compromised, not through high-tech surveillance or intelligence leaks, but through the simple curiosity of a junior maintenance worker who had observed their weekly pattern and grown suspicious. Aisha Dallo had been employed at the presidential PIS for just 3 months, assigned to the cleaning staff for the West Wing. She had noticed the Wednesday afternoon security restrictions and the mysterious room that wasn't on any official palace map. More significantly, she had noticed something none of the archive's sophisticated security measures had been designed to detect: the subtle changes in temperature and humidity in the service corridor caused by the hidden room's environment systems. This observation might have meant nothing to an ordinary cleaner, but Aisha was far from ordinary. Before taking the palace position, she had completed 3 years of studies in geological engineering at the University of Ouagadougou, specializing in resource detection and extraction technologies. Her academic career had been interrupted by financial difficulties, the same economic pressures that forced many talented young Burkinabe to abandon higher education. But what had begun as financial necessity had evolved into something more. Red Door, she had seen something that piqued her interest further. A brief glimpse of a document left carelessly in Minister Euro's folder, as he exited a partial map of mineral deposits across West Africa with notations she didn't understand. What Aisha hadn't told her employers at the palace was that she wasn't Morelia Cleaner. She was a graduate student in geological engineering who had taken the position specifically to gain proximity to government resource data for her research on sustainable mining practices. The glimpse of that map showing resource deposits that didn't appear in any public geological survey had confirmed her suspicion that the government possessed mineral data it wasn't sharing with the academic community. The implications were significant for her research. If the government had more detailed information about mineral deposits than was publicly available, it could revolutionize her work on minimizing environmental impact in extraction processes. The specific deposits she'd glimpsed on the map appeared to be rare earth elements, exactly the focus of her thesis project. As she continued her cleaning duties that evening, Aisha made a decision. Next Wednesday, she would find a way to see what lay behind the red door. Perhaps by manipulating the maintenance schedule, she could create a legitimate reason to bean the restricted area during the mysterious weekly meeting. She had no way of knowing that this simple act of curiosity would set in motion events that would eventually force the archive into the open, transforming it from a secret intelligence operation into something far more revolutionary. The foundation for a Pan-African resource sovereignty movement that would fundamentally shape global economic power. Aisha's decision to investigate the Red Door wasn't driven by political ideology or evolutionary zeal. Her motivations were purely academic, a researcher's natural desire to access data relevant to her. Yet, in a world where information about Africa's resources had been deliberately controlled for centuries, even this innocent curiosity represented a profound challenge to established power structures. As she finished her shift and left the palace grounds, Aisha's mind was already formulating a plan to access the mysterious room. Shahad noticed that the security systems required biometric authentication, something she couldn't possibly fake, but perhaps there were other vulnerabilities, other ways to glimpse what happened behind the door. What she didn't realize was that her growing interest in the West Wing had already been noted. Palace security systems include movement tracking and behavioral analysis designed to identify unusual patterns among staff. Aisha's repeated presence near the Red Door during cleaning rounds, her lingering near air vents, her inspection of electrical panels, all had generated low-level alerts in the security system. These alerts hadn't yet reached human review, but they were accumulating in the system, gradually building a pattern that would eventually trigger notification to Colonel Continuity security team. It was a race between Aisha's curiosity and the palace's security algorithms. A race that would ultimately determine whether the archive remained secret or became public knowledge. Meanwhile, in his private office, President Ibrahim Traoré reviewed the day's archive session notes. Already planning the next phase of what he had come to think of as Africa's most important intelligence operation, an operation based not on gathering secrets, but on exposing the most damaging secret of all. The detailed blueprint of how of post-colonial independence had been constructed to mask continued resource extraction. Third Chiv's work extended for. It was actively mapping current control mechanisms, developing counterterrorism, and creating financial and legal tools that African nations could use to regain genuine sovereignty over their resources. Most significantly, it was building a network of informed leaders across the continent, leaders who understood not just that they were being exploited, but exactly how that exploitation was structured and maintained. This knowledge was transformative, shifting the power dynamic between African governments and their former colonial partners. The Red Door kept this work hidden, not just from foreign intelligence services, but from the Burkina Faso people themselves. A necessary secrecy that Somata Mestrad Traoré conscience, but which he considered essential until the work was complete enough to withstand the international response. Its revelation would provoke, "We'll open for autopsy, but not yet. Not until we've documented enough of the system to ensure it can never bear built." That day would come sooner than he anticipated. Catalyzed by the curiosity of a cleaner with a geologic Landron degree and a determination to understand what her country's leaders were hiding about the wealth beneath her soil, a collision of secrecy and curiosity that would eventually transform the archive from Burkina Faso's most closely guarded secret into Africa's most powerful tool for resource liberation. As he closed the file containing Thurchiv's latest findings, Traoré reflected on the historical irony of their work. The wine cellar where they now documented mentions of Nyack colonial control had once stored fine wines, imported from France for the colonial governor's pleasure, wines produced from grapes grown on lands worked by African laborers. then shipped to Africa to be consumed by European elites who administered the extraction of African resources. The circular nature of this exploitation, Africans producing luxury, goods they couldn't afford, which were consumed by Europeans overseeing the extraction of African wealth, embodied the very systems the archive was now documenting and countering. That thuwuk of liberation was occurring in a space originally designed to store the symbolic fruits of this exploitations fitting to Traore. History had a way of coming full circle of transformative change, merging from thievery structures built to prevent it. What remained to be seen was whether the archive's work would remain hidden behind the red door long enough to reach its full potential, or whether Aisha Diop's curiosity would expose it prematurely. Libor, its protective network, was strong enough to withstand the inevitable backlash from Thozo's power it threatened. This tension between necessary secrecy and the public's right to know, between strategic patience and urgent action, had defined liberation struggles throughout Africa's history. Now it would determine the fate of perhaps the most significant liberation effort of all, the fight to reclaim not just political independence, but the economic sovereignty that made such independence meaningful. As night fell over Ouagadougou, the red door stood silent in the palace's west wing, its secrets temporarily secure. But the forces that would ultimately force it open were already in motion. A young cleaner's curiosity, a security system's algorithms, and the inexorable momentum of a continent increasingly determined to control its own resources and destiny. The coming week would determine whether the archive remained Burkina Faso's most closely guarded secret or became the catalyst for Africa's most profound economic transformation since independence. I've identified what appears to be a secondary archive in Switzerland, private banking documents related to what they called special resource acquisition funds from 19 Shedsplayed, an index document showing hundreds of transaction records. These would document financial incentives provided to specific African officials who facilitated continued resource access. After independence, that compliance payments, Minister Ouedraogo said, "We've seen references to them in other documents, but never the..." "Can you access them?" Traore asked. Dr. Sankara hesitated, possibly, but not remotely. "The records are in physical form, stored in a private vault facility in Geneva. Someone would need to access them directly." The implications hung in the air. An operation would extend their activities buying digital research and into something approaching espionage. "I have contacts in Geneva," Colonel Canade said carefully, "people who might be able to help with such access discreetly." Traore considered this. "Prepare a feasibility stunt, Colonel. No action without my explicit approval." These records would be valuable, but not at the cost of exposing the archive's existence. As the meeting concluded and they prepared to leave the secure room, Traore paused to survey what they had built. What had begun as a historical research project had evolved into something that was actively reshaping Africa's relationship with former colonial powers. Not through public confrontation, but through the quiet power of information asymmetry. "Sometimes," he remarked to his small team, "the most effective revolution is theon your opponent doesn't realize is happening until it's already succeeded." They ascended the stairs in their customary exit order. First Minister Euro, then Dr. Sankara, followed by Colonel Kate with President Traore. The security systems reset behind them, once again concealing one of the most closely guarded secrets. In Africa Bend, an unassuming red door in an old colonial palace. What none of them realized as they turned to their public duties was that the archive's secrecy had already been compromised, not through tech surveillance or intelligence leaks, but through the simple curiosity of a junior maintenance worker who had observed their weekly pattern and grown suspicious. Aisha Diop had been employed at the presidential palace for just 3 months. Assigned to the cleaning staff for the West Wing, she had noticed the Wednesday afternoon security restrictions and the mysterious room that wasn't on any official palace map. More significantly, she had noticed that something none of Thurchiv's sophisticated security measures had been designed to detect the subtle changes in temperature and humidity in the service corridor caused by the hidden rooms, environmental control systems. Earlier that day, while checking an electrical panel near the red door, she had seen something that piqued her interest. A brief glimpse of a document left carelessly in Minister Yariogo's folder as he exited a partial map of mineral deposits across West Africa with notations she didn't understand. What hadn't told her employers at the palace was that she wasn't merely a cleaner. Chu was a graduate student in geological engineering who had taken the positions physically to gain proximity to government resource data for her research on sustainable. The glimpse of that map showing resource deposits that didn't appear in any public geological survey had confirmed her suspicion that the government possessed mineral data it wasn't sharing with academic community. As she continued her cleaning duties that evening, Aisha made a decision. Next Wednesday, she would find a way to see what lay behind the red door. She had no way of knowing that this simple act of curiosity would set in motion events that would eventually force the archive into the open, transforming it from Askret's intelligence operation into something far more revolutionary. The foundation for a Pan-African resource sovereignty movement that willed fundamentalish global economic power. But that was a week away. For now, the secret of the red door remained secure. One of many hidden fronts in the ongoing struggle for true African independence. Fought not with weapons or public protests, but with the painstaking documentation of the very systems designed to perpetuate external control while maintaining the illusion of sovereignty. Inside his private office, President Ibrahim Traoré viewed Thede's archive session notes, already planning the next phase of what he had come to think of as Africa's most important intelligence operation, an operation based not on gathering secrets, but on exposing the most damaging secret of all, the detailed blueprint of how the illusion of post-colonial independence did being constructed to mask continued resource extraction. The Red Door kept this work hidden, not just from foreign intelligence services, but from the Burkina Faso people themselves. A necessary secrecy that sometimes rod Traoré's conscience, but which he considered essential until the work was complete enough. To withstand the international response, its revelation would provoke one day. He murmured to himself, the Red Door will open for all to see, but not yet. Not until we've documented enough of the system to ensure it can never bear. That day comes sooner than he anticipated, catalyzed by the curiosity of a cleaner with a geologic Landrin degree, and a determination to understand what her country's leaders were hiding about the wealth beneath their soil, a collision of secrecy and curiosity that would eventually transform the archive from Burkina Faso's most closely guarded secret into Africa's most powerful tool for resource liberation.